The sun blazed down on the parking lot of Greenwood High School, casting long shadows over the sleek, polished cars lined up in neat rows. It was a typical morning, with groups of students gathering around their vehicles, chatting and laughing before the start of the school day. Among them were Chad and Kyle, two of the most popular boys in school, who stood by their gleaming sports cars, basking in the attention of their peers. Chad, tall with a cocky grin, leaned against his brand new shiny red convertible, casually tossing a football from hand to hand. Kyle, shorter but equally arrogant, adjusted the mirror on his custom black sedan, making sure it reflected his perfectly styled hair. The two of them exuded confidence, their every move followed by admiring glances and envious whispers from the surrounding students. "Man, I can't wait for the party this weekend," Kyle said, glancing over at Chad. "Jessica's gonna be there, and you know she's got her eyes on one of us." Chad smirked, flipping the football into the air and catching it effortlessly. "She's definitely going to choose me. I mean, who wouldn't want to ride in this beauty?" He patted the hood of his car, his voice dripping with self-assurance. Before Kyle could respond, a loud, rumbling noise interrupted their conversation. Both boys turned their heads to see a beat-up old sedan pulling into the parking lot. The car sputtered and groaned as it made its way to an empty spot, the engine coughing one last time before finally cutting off. The driver, James, stepped out, his expression calm despite the mocking laughter that erupted around him. James was a quiet, unassuming kid who kept to himself. He was known for his intelligence and hard work, but in a school like Greenwood, where appearances mattered more than anything, his old car and modest clothes made him an easy target for ridicule. Chad and Kyle exchanged glances, a wicked grin spreading across Chad's face as he saw an opportunity to entertain the crowd. "Hey, James," Chad called out, his voice loud and mocking. "Nice ride, man. Did you pull that thing out of a junkyard or what?" Laughter echoed through the parking lot as students turned to watch the spectacle. James paused, his hand on the car door, but he didn't respond. He simply closed the door gently, ignoring the taunts, and began to walk towards the school building. Kyle, not wanting to be outdone, chimed in. "Seriously, James, how do you even get that thing to start in the morning? Do you have to push it downhill?" More laughter followed, and James felt the sting of their words, though he kept his face expressionless. He knew better than to engage with them. It would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on the path ahead, each step feeling heavier as the laughter echoed behind him. But just as he was about to enter the building, he heard a voice that made him stop in his tracks. "Leave him alone, guys. It's not funny." James turned slightly to see Jessica, the most popular girl in school, standing a few feet away. Her tone was firm, and her usually cheerful expression was clouded with disapproval. Chad and Kyle fell silent, their smirks fading as they realized they had crossed a line. Jessica was not only the girl everyone wanted to be with, but she was also one of the few people at school who didn't tolerate bullying. Chad recovered quickly, flashing Jessica a charming smile. "Come on, Jess, we were just joking around. No harm done, right?" But Jessica wasn't buying it. She gave him a look that could freeze water, then turned her attention to James. "Don't listen to them, James. Your car is fine." James was surprised by her defense, but nodded slightly, grateful for her support. As he walked away, he could feel the eyes of the entire parking lot on him. But this time, it didn't feel as bad. Jessica's words had taken some of the sting out of the situation. Chad and Kyle exchanged uneasy glances, the fun drained out of their morning. They hadn't expected Jessica to side with James, and now their planned day of making fun of him seemed far less entertaining. But in their minds, this was just a minor setback. They would figure out a way to win Jessica over at the party, where they could show off their cars and wealth without the interference of a rusty old sedan, and the kid who drove it. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the school day, the students dispersed, leaving Chad and Kyle standing by their cars, their confidence slightly shaken. Meanwhile, James entered the school building, his mind already shifting back to his studies and the long day ahead. But as he walked down the hallway, he couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. As the day progressed, James tried to focus on his classes, but the morning's incident kept replaying in his mind. It wasn't the first time Chad and Kyle had made fun of him, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Still, something about today felt different. Jessica's words had stayed with him, giving him a small but significant boost of confidence. He wasn't used to anyone standing up for him, especially someone as popular as Jessica. Lunchtime rolled around, and James headed to his usual spot, a quiet table near the back of the cafeteria where he could eat in peace. He pulled out his sandwich, trying to tune out the noise around him. The cafeteria was buzzing with the usual chatter, but James noticed that today, the gossip seemed to be about him. He could hear snippets of conversation from nearby tables, students whispering about the scene in the parking lot. "Did you see Jessica standing up for James?" "Yeah, that was crazy. I didn't think she'd even know his name." "I heard Chad and Kyle are pretty pissed about it. They're planning something for the party this weekend." James tried to ignore it, but it was hard. He knew how things worked at Greenwood High. Attention from someone like Jessica could make or break your social standing. He didn't want to be dragged into the drama, but it seemed inevitable. Just as he was finishing his lunch, a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see Jessica standing there, a tray in her hands and a friendly smile on her face. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, her tone casual but warm. James was too stunned to respond immediately. He quickly nodded, moving his books aside to make room for her. Jessica sat down, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. James was acutely aware of the stares they were getting from around the cafeteria, but Jessica seemed completely unfazed. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened this morning," she said, breaking the silence. "Chad and Kyle can be real jerks sometimes." James shrugged, trying to downplay it. "It's no big deal. I'm used to it." Jessica frowned slightly. "That doesn't make it right. They shouldn't treat you like that." James appreciated her concern, but he didn't want to dwell on the negativity. "Thanks for saying something," he replied, keeping his voice low. "But you don't have to worry about me. I can handle it." Jessica studied him for a moment, as if trying to figure him out. "You're different from most of the guys here, you know that?" James wasn't sure how to respond, so he just nodded again, feeling a bit awkward under her gaze. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, especially not from someone like Jessica. Before the conversation could go any further, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Jessica stood up, giving him a quick smile. "I'll see you around, James." As she walked away, James couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. It wasn't every day that the most popular girl in school sat with him at lunch, let alone defended him in front of everyone. He knew this wasn't just a random act of kindness. There was something more to it, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. James did his best to stay focused on his classes, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Jessica. He knew that her actions would have consequences, not just for him, but for her as well. Chad and Kyle were bound to retaliate, and Jessica's popularity could take a hit for associating with him. He didn't want to be the cause of any trouble for her, but it seemed like things were already set in motion. By the time the final bell rang, James was exhausted, both mentally and physically. He headed to the parking lot, dreading the possibility of another encounter with Chad and Kyle. But when he reached his car, he found it untouched, and the lot was mostly empty. It seemed they had decided to lay low for now. James climbed into his car, the familiar scent of worn leather and engine oil comforting him. This car had been his father's, and despite its age and rough condition, it meant the world to him. Working on it was his way of staying connected to his dad, and he took pride in keeping it running, even if it wasn't flashy or new. As he drove home, James thought about the upcoming party. He hadn't planned on going. It wasn't really his scene, but now he was considering it. Part of him wanted to avoid the drama altogether, but another part, the part that was tired of being pushed around, wanted to show up, not for the party, but for himself. He arrived home, parking the car in the small garage where he spent most of his free time. After changing out of his school clothes, he went straight to work, popping the hood and checking the engine. He knew every inch of this car, every scratch and dent, and he cared for it with the same dedication that his father had. As he worked, he let his mind wander, thinking about what Jessica had said and done. Maybe this was his chance to change things, to stop being the target of jokes and start standing up for himself. It wouldn't be easy, but if there was one thing James knew how to do, it was work hard. He was determined to make the most of this opportunity, whatever it might be. The next day at school, the atmosphere felt tense, as if the whole student body was waiting for something to happen. James could feel the eyes on him as he walked through the hallways, whispers and sideways glances following his every move. It was as if his encounter with Jessica had shifted the social dynamics, and everyone was trying to figure out what it meant. In his first class, James noticed Jessica sitting near the front, her usual spot. She looked as composed as ever, but James could tell she was aware of the attention they were both getting. She caught his eye and gave him a small, encouraging smile, which he returned with a nod. It was a brief exchange, but it was enough to remind James that he wasn't alone in this, even if it felt like the whole school was watching. As the day went on, James tried to stay focused on his work, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was brewing. Sure enough, during lunch, Chad and Kyle made their move. James was sitting at his usual table, reading through his notes, when he noticed the cafeteria getting quieter. He looked up to see Chad and Kyle approaching, flanked by a couple of their friends. They were all smirking, clearly enjoying the attention they were getting as they made their way toward him. "Hey, James," Chad said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness as he sat down across from him. Kyle took the seat next to him, casually stretching his arms across the back of the chair like he owned the place. James looked up, trying to keep his expression neutral. "What do you want, Chad?" Kyle leaned forward, a smirk playing on his lips. "We just wanted to have a little chat, man. You know, about the party this weekend." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to deal with. "What about it?" Chad chuckled, glancing around the cafeteria to make sure they had an audience. "Well, we couldn't help but notice that you've been getting a lot of attention lately. From certain people." He emphasized the last part, making it clear who he was referring to. James met Chad's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "What's your point?" "My point is," Chad continued, leaning in closer, "that you're out of your league, man. Jessica's just being nice to you because she feels sorry for you. But don't get the wrong idea. She's not interested in you. Not really." Kyle nodded, his expression smug. "Yeah, you're just a project to her, James. Something to make her feel good about herself. But when it comes down to it, she's going to choose someone who can actually keep up with her. Someone like us." James felt his temper rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew they were trying to provoke him, to get him to react in front of everyone. But he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. "Is that what you think?" James asked, his voice steady. "Because it sounds to me like you're just scared that she might actually like someone who isn't like you." Chad's eyes narrowed, the smirk slipping from his face. Watch it, James. You're playing a dangerous game here. Kyle leaned back, crossing his arms. Yeah. And you're going to lose. We'll make sure of it. James met their glares without flinching. We'll see about that. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment it felt like a fight might break out right there in the cafeteria. But before things could escalate, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Chad and Kyle stood up, giving James one last disdainful look before walking away, their friends trailing behind them. As they left, James let out a breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding. He knew this was just the beginning. Chad and Kyle weren't going to let this go, and the party was clearly going to be the stage for whatever they had planned. But James wasn't about to back down. He had come too far to let them intimidate him now. Later that afternoon, as James walked to his car after school, he saw Jessica waiting by the driver's side door. She looked concerned, her usual bright smile replaced with a worried frown. "James," she called out as he approached. "Can we talk?" He nodded, unlocking the car and opening the door, but instead of getting in, he turned to face her. "What's up?" "I heard what happened at lunch," she said, her voice low so that the few remaining students in the parking lot wouldn't overhear. Chad and Kyle are jerks, but they can also be really nasty when they want to be. I'm worried about what they might do at the party. James shrugged, trying to downplay his own concerns. "I'm not scared of them, Jessica. I can handle whatever they throw at me." Jessica sighed, looking down at her feet before meeting his gaze again. "I know you can, but I just don't want you to get hurt. You don't have to prove anything to them or to anyone else." James appreciated her concern, but he knew this was about more than just proving something to Chad and Kyle. It was about standing up for himself and showing everyone that he wasn't just some kid they could push around. "I'm going to that party," James said firmly. "And I'm going to have a good time no matter what they try to pull." Jessica studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay. But if you need anything, you can count on me." James smiled, touched by her support. "Thanks, Jessica. That means a lot." She smiled back, the worry in her eyes fading slightly. "I'll see you there, then." As Jessica walked away, James felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew the party was going to be a turning point, one way or another, and whatever happened, he was ready to face it head on. The night of the party arrived, and the air was buzzing with excitement. Greenwood High's biggest event of the year was being held at Chad's massive house, a sprawling mansion that seemed more like a resort than a family home. The party was already in full swing by the time James pulled up in his old sedan, parking a little way down the street to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to his car. As he walked up the long driveway, the sounds of music and laughter grew louder. James could feel the nerves building in his stomach, but he pushed them down. He was here for a reason, and he wasn't going to let Chad and Kyle intimidate him out of showing up. He'd worked too hard to back down now. The house was packed with students, everyone dressed to impress. The party was a spectacle of wealth and status, with kids lounging by the pool, dancing in the huge living room, and chatting in small groups around the garden. James spotted a few familiar faces, but most of the people here were from the popular crowd, kids who normally wouldn't give him a second glance. As he made his way through the throng, he caught sight of Jessica standing near the edge of the pool, talking to a group of her friends. She looked stunning, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit that highlighted her natural beauty. James felt a pang of self-consciousness, but when she noticed him, her face lit up with a smile that made him feel a little more at ease. "James, you made it," Jessica called out, waving him over. James smiled back and walked toward her, trying to ignore the curious stares he was getting from the people around them. Jessica's friends watched him with a mix of surprise and mild interest. but none of them said anything as he joined their circle. "Hey," James said, trying to sound casual, though he felt anything but. "I'm glad you came," Jessica said sincerely. "You look great." James glanced down at his outfit, a simple shirt and jeans, and shrugged. "Thanks. You look amazing, as always." Jessica blushed slightly, and for a moment they stood there, smiling at each other, ignoring the rest of the world, but the moment was short-lived. "Look who decided to show up," a voice called out from behind them. James turned to see Chad and Kyle approaching, drinks in hand and matching smirks on their faces. The crowd around them parted slightly, sensing the tension that was about to unfold. Chad was dressed in an expensive designer outfit, while Kyle sported a leather jacket that probably cost more than James's car. Jessica's smile faded, and she took a small step closer to James, as if to show her support. "What do you want, Chad?" she asked, her tone cold. Chad ignored her question, focusing instead on James. "So, you actually had the guts to show up, huh? I didn't think you'd be brave enough to walk through that door, considering, well, you." James felt the blood rush to his face, but he kept his voice calm. "Why wouldn't I? It's just a party." Kyle chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "Yeah, a party where everyone's supposed to bring their best. But I guess you missed that memo." James didn't rise to the bait. "I'm here, aren't I?" Chad's eyes narrowed, the playful tone slipping from his voice. "Let's cut to the chase, James. You don't belong here. This isn't your scene. Why don't you just save yourself the embarrassment and leave before you make a fool of yourself?" James felt the anger boiling up inside him, but before he could respond, Jessica stepped in. "Back off, Chad. He's here as my guest, and if you have a problem with that, then maybe you should be the one to leave." Chad's smirk returned, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes. Frustration, maybe even jealousy. "Oh, I get it now. You're his charity case, right? You're just trying to make yourself feel better by hanging out with the kid from the wrong side of the tracks." Jessica's expression hardened, and she took another step closer to James, slipping her arm through his. "I'm here with James because I want to be. Not because of charity, and not because of anything you or Kyle think. So, if you can't handle that, maybe you should stop trying to make it your business." The crowd was silent, watching the exchange with rapt attention. James could feel the eyes on him, but for the first time, he didn't feel the familiar sense of dread. Instead, he felt a surge of confidence, bolstered by Jessica's unwavering support. Chad's face darkened, and he looked like he was about to say something else, but Kyle cut in, trying to diffuse the tension. "Come on, Chad, it's not worth it. Let's just go grab another drink." Chad hesitated for a moment, then turned on his heel and walked away, Kyle following close behind. The crowd began to disperse, the moment of confrontation over, but James could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Jessica turned to him, her eyes full of concern. "Are you okay?" James nodded, though his heart was still racing. "Yeah. Thanks for standing up for me." "You don't need to thank me," Jessica said softly. "You don't deserve to be treated like that. No one does." James looked around the party, seeing it with new eyes. He realized that, for the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was actually standing his ground. And it felt good. "I think I'm going to grab some fresh air," James said, needing a moment to process everything. Jessica nodded. "I'll come with you." They walked out to the garden together, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stuffy atmosphere inside. As they found a quiet spot to sit, James couldn't help but feel like something had shifted. He wasn't the same person who had walked into this party feeling out of place. He was different now, stronger, more sure of himself. And as he sat there with Jessica, he knew that whatever happened next, he was ready for it. The garden was peaceful, with the distant sounds of the party muffled by the tall hedges surrounding the yard. James and Jessica sat on a low stone bench, the soft glow of string lights casting a warm, almost magical ambiance around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. James took a deep breath, letting the cool air calm his nerves. He still couldn't quite believe what had just happened, standing up to Chad and Kyle with Jessica at his side. It felt surreal, like he was living someone else's life. But the steady rhythm of his heartbeat reminded him that this was real, that he had finally taken a stand. Jessica broke the silence, her voice gentle. You know, James, I've always admired how you never let them get to you. It takes a lot of strength to keep your head up when people are constantly trying to bring you down. James glanced at her, surprised. I don't know if I'd call it strength. Most of the time, I just try to stay out of their way. Jessica shook her head, her expression earnest. No, it's more than that. You don't let them change who you are. A lot of people would have given up or tried to be someone they're not just to fit in, but not you. You're true to yourself, and that's something I really respect. James felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He had never thought of it that way before, but hearing it from Jessica made him realize that maybe she was right. Maybe there was strength in staying true to who he was, even when it wasn't easy. Thanks, he said quietly. That means a lot, coming from you. Jessica smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made his heart skip a beat. You're welcome. And for what it's worth, I'm really glad you came tonight. James looked out over the garden, the night air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. He felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in a long time, like the weight he had been carrying for so long had finally started to lift. I wasn't sure if I should, James admitted, but I'm glad I did too. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just enjoying each other's company. The distant music from the party provided a soothing backdrop, and for the first time in a long time, James felt at peace. But the night wasn't over yet. As they were sitting there, lost in the moment, James heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Chad and Kyle walking towards them, a determined look on Chad's face. It was clear that he hadn't let go of the earlier confrontation, and he wasn't ready to let things slide. Jessica noticed them too, and she tensed slightly, her hand tightening around James. What do they want now? She muttered, clearly annoyed. Chad stopped a few feet away from them, his expression hard. You think you're better than us, don't you, James? Just because Jessica's decided to take pity on you? James stood up slowly, facing Chad. He could feel Jessica's hand slip from his, but he knew she was still with him, supporting him. This isn't about being better than anyone, Chad. I'm just tired of letting people like you walk all over me. Kyle scoffed, crossing his arms. People like us? What's that supposed to mean? James met Chad's gaze, refusing to back down. It means that I'm done being your punching bag. You don't get to decide who's worth something and who's not. And if you have a problem with that, then maybe you're the one who needs to rethink some things. Chad's face twisted in anger, but before he could say anything, Jessica stepped forward. He's right, Chad. This whole tough guy act, it's getting old. Maybe it's time you looked in the mirror and figured out why you feel the need to put others down to make yourself feel better. Kyle opened his mouth to retort, but Chad held up a hand, silencing him. For a moment, Chad just stared at James, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, Kyle trailing after him, confused but unwilling to challenge his friend. James watched them go, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. He hadn't expected Chad to back down so easily, but maybe Jessica's words had struck a nerve. Maybe, just maybe, Chad was starting to realize that he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Jessica turned to James, her expression softening. Are you okay? James nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Yeah, I think I am. Jessica smiled, reaching out to take his hand again. Come on, let's go back inside. I think we've had enough drama for one night. James chuckled, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. Yeah, that sounds good. They walked back into the house together, hand in hand. As they rejoined the party, James noticed the way people looked at him had changed. There was no more mocking, no more dismissive glances. Instead, there was respect, curiosity, and maybe even a little admiration. For the first time in his life, James felt like he truly belonged. The rest of the night passed in a blur, but in the best way possible. James felt a sense of freedom and lightness as he moved through the party, mingling with people who, for the first time, seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him. Jessica stayed by his side, introducing him to her friends and making sure he felt included. It was a world away from the loneliness and isolation he had grown accustomed to at school. As the party began to wind down, James found himself back in the garden with Jessica. The air was cool, and the sky above was dotted with stars. It was quiet now, the sounds of the party fading into the background as the last few stragglers made their way home. James and Jessica sat on the same stone bench where they had shared their earlier conversation, but now the atmosphere was different. The tension and uncertainty had been replaced by a sense of calm and connection, and James felt more at ease than he had in a long time. I had a really good time tonight, James said, breaking the comfortable silence. He turned to Jessica, his heart swelling with gratitude. Thanks for everything. I don't know if I could have done it without you. Jessica smiled, a soft, affectionate look in her eyes. You didn't need me, James. You've had it in you all along. I just helped you see it. James felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He knew she was right. Tonight had been a turning point, a moment when he had finally stepped out of the shadows and taken control of his own story. And while Jessica had played a big part in that, he also knew that the strength had come from within him. Still, he said, smiling back at her, I'm glad you were there. They sat in silence for a moment, the connection between them growing stronger with each passing second. James felt like he could talk to Jessica about anything, that she understood him in a way no one else ever had. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice soft and sincere. James, I've seen a lot of people at this school who think they're better than everyone else because of what they have or who they know. But you're different. You're real, and that's something rare. James looked into her eyes, seeing the honesty in her words. He realized that, for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to be rich or popular to be worth something. He was enough just as he was. Thanks, Jessica, he said, his voice full of emotion. That means more to me than you know. Jessica leaned in closer, and for a moment it felt like the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving just the two of them in this quiet, perfect moment. James felt his heart race as she smiled up at him, her face inches from his. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they both leaned in, closing the distance between them. The kiss was soft and gentle, full of all the unspoken words and emotions that had been building between them all night. It was a promise, a beginning, and a moment that James knew he would never forget. When they finally pulled away, both of them were smiling, a shared understanding passing between them. It wasn't just about the kiss, It was about everything that had led up to it. The night, the confrontation, the realization that they were stronger together than they were apart. I guess we should probably head back, Jessica said, her voice tinged with reluctance. Yeah, James agreed, though he wished they could stay in this moment forever. They stood up, still holding hands, and made their way back to the house. The party was all but over now, with just a few students lingering around. But as James and Jessica walked through the front door, he felt like a different person than the one who had arrived earlier that night. As they stepped outside, James saw his old car parked down the street, and for the first time, he didn't feel embarrassed by it. It wasn't flashy or new, but it was his, a piece of his history and a symbol of how far he had come. He realized that it wasn't the car that mattered, it was the journey he had taken in it. I can give you a ride home if you want, James offered, turning to Jessica with a shy smile. Jessica squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. I'd like that. They walked to his car, and as James opened the passenger door for her, he felt a sense of pride. Not because of the car itself, but because of what it represented. Resilience, hard work, and the ability to rise above whatever life threw at him. As they drove away from the party, the stars shining bright above them, James felt a deep sense of contentment. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he was excited to find out. With Jessica by his side and a newfound confidence in himself, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. As they pulled up to Jessica's house, she leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, a sweet, lingering gesture that made his heart soar. Good night, James, she said softly. I'll see you at school. Good night, Jessica, James replied, his voice filled with warmth. He watched as she walked up to her front door, giving him one last smile before disappearing inside. As he drove home, the events of the night played over in his mind, and he couldn't help but smile. It had been a night of challenges, of standing up for himself and finding the strength he didn't know he had. But most importantly, it had been a night of connection, of finding someone who saw him for who he really was and liked him just the same. James knew that things wouldn't always be easy. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt, but tonight had shown him that he could face whatever came his way. And with that knowledge, he felt ready for anything. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, James sat in the quiet for a moment, savoring the stillness. He had come a long way, and there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, he felt truly at peace with who he was. He got out of the car, locking it behind him, and headed inside. As he closed the door behind him, James knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter that he was ready to write, one page at a time.